The velvet jewelry boxes sat arranged on Grandma Eleanor's mahogany dining table like accusations, each one bearing a granddaughter's name written in her careful script. Sarah's box contained the pearl earrings that had belonged to Eleanor's mother. Jessica's held the sapphire bracelet from Eleanor's wedding day. Madison's housed the delicate gold locket with the tiny rose engraving. Even little Emma, barely 16, had received the silver charm bracelet that jingled with decades of collected memories. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. But there was no box for me. I stood in the doorway of the dining room, still wearing my black funeral dress, the fabric clinging uncomfortably to my skin in the humid August heat. The scent of lilies from the funeral arrangements mixed with the familiar smell of Eleanor's lavender potpourri, creating a nauseating combination that made my stomach churn. My cousins clustered around the table, their voices a mixture of grief and excitement, as they opened their inherited treasures. "Oh my God, look at this!" Sarah gasped, holding up the pearls to catch the afternoon light streaming through Eleanor's lace curtains. I remember her wearing these to every family Christmas. Jessica was already fastening the sapphire bracelet around her wrist, the blue stones catching the light like tiny fragments of sky. She always said this would be mine someday. I can't believe she's really gone. I cleared my throat softly, and the room fell silent. 5 pairs of eyes turned toward me, and I saw something I'd never expected to see in my family's faces. Discomfort. Shame, even. My Aunt Patricia, Eleanor's eldest daughter, stepped forward with a manila envelope in her hands. "Lily," she said, her voice carefully controlled, "your grandmother, she left you this." The envelope felt thin in my hands, too light to contain anything valuable. Inside was a single sheet of Eleanor's personal stationery, the cream-colored paper with her monogram at the top. Her handwriting, usually so elegant, seemed shakier here, as if written with an unsteady hand. "To my granddaughter Lily, you have always been different from the others. While I leave precious jewels to my other granddaughters, I cannot in good conscience give you what you do not deserve. Perhaps one day you will understand why. The truth has a way of revealing itself when the time is right. Look for what matters most in the place where secrets are kept. Eleanor." The words hit me like a physical blow. I read them twice, 3 times, hoping I had misunderstood. But there it was, in black and white, my own grandmother's declaration that I didn't deserve her love, her legacy, her precious things that she'd carefully distributed among my cousins. "I don't understand," I whispered, looking up at my Aunt Patricia. "What does this mean? What didn't I deserve?" Patricia's face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Your grandmother, she had her reasons, Lily. She never explained them to us, but she was very specific about her wishes." My cousin Madison, always the peacekeeper, stepped forward with her new locket clutched in her hand. "Maybe she left you something else. Maybe there's more somewhere." But I could see in everyone's faces that they knew there wasn't. They'd all been present when the will was read, when the lawyer had methodically gone through Eleanor's belongings and distributed them according to her wishes. The house would go to Patricia, the oldest child. The antique furniture would be divided among Eleanor's 3 children. The china and silverware had been specifically allocated to various family members. And the jewelry, all of it, every precious piece Eleanor had collected over her 83 years of life had been given to her granddaughters. All of them. Except me. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope, my hands trembling slightly. The room felt too small suddenly, the air too thick.
Through the window, I could see Eleanor's garden, where the roses she'd tended for 30 years were beginning to wilt in the heat. Even they seemed to be mourning her passing. "I should go," I said quietly, backing toward the doorway.
Lily, wait! It was my Uncle Robert, Patricia's younger brother, stepping forward with genuine concern in his eyes. "Maybe we can figure this out together. She was complicated, you know that. This doesn't mean she didn't love you. But the damage was done." The letter felt like it was burning a hole in my purse as I walked through Eleanor's house one last time, past the photographs lining the hallway where my face appeared in family portraits, but somehow always seemed slightly separate from the others. Past the kitchen where she'd taught all of us to make her famous chocolate chip cookies, though mine never seemed to turn out quite right. Past the living room where she'd held court during family gatherings, dispensing wisdom and gentle corrections with equal measure. I paused at the front door, my hand on the brass doorknob that Eleanor polished every week without fail. The house felt different now, as if her absence had changed the very air within its walls. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily, counting the seconds of a world that would continue without her. A world where I would have to carry the weight of her final message to me. Outside, the late summer evening was settling over the neighborhood like a soft blanket. Eleanor's street was lined with old oak trees that had witnessed decades of family gatherings, birthday parties, and holiday celebrations. The Hendersons next door were watering their garden, pretending not to watch as family members emerged from Eleanor's house, carrying boxes and bags of memories. I walked to my car slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. As I reached for the door handle, I heard footsteps behind me. "Lily, honey, wait up." It was my cousin Sarah, still wearing the pearl earrings. Up close, I could see that they were even more beautiful than I had realized, with a lustrous quality that spoke of careful preservation over generations. They looked perfect on her, I had to admit. Sarah had Eleanor's delicate features and the same graceful way of moving that had made our grandmother such a striking woman in her youth. "I feel terrible about this," Sarah said, her hand touching one of the pearls nervously. "It doesn't make sense. You were always one of her favorites." Was I? The question came out more bitterly than I had intended, because this letter suggests otherwise. Sarah frowned, pulling out her phone. "Here, look at this." She scrolled through her photos until she found what she was looking for. "This is from last Christmas." The photo showed the entire family gathered around Eleanor's tree, a tradition we'd maintained for over 20 years. Eleanor sat in her favorite armchair, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, and there, right next to her chair, was me. Eleanor's hand was resting on my shoulder, and we were both laughing at something someone had said off camera. "She always made sure you sat next to her. At every family dinner, every holiday, every special occasion. You were the one she called when she needed help with her computer. You were the one she asked to drive her to doctor's appointments when Patricia was busy." It was true. For the past 5 years, since I'd graduated college and moved back to town, I'd been Eleanor's unofficial caretaker. Not because anyone had asked me to, but because it had felt natural. I'd enjoyed our time together, treasured our conversations about books and gardening, and her memories of my grandfather, who died when I was young. "Then why?" I asked, holding up the envelope. "Why this?" Sarah shook her head, her expression genuinely puzzled. "I don't know, but Lily, you knew her better than any of us. If anyone can figure out what she meant, it's you."
I looked back at Eleanor's house, where warm light glowed in the windows, and the rest of my family was still examining their inherited treasures. The house where I'd spent countless hours over the years, where I'd helped Eleanor preserve her memories and maintain her independence as she aged. The house that now felt like it held more secrets than memories. "Look for what matters most in the place where secrets are kept," I murmured,
repeating the cryptic line from Eleanor's letter. What? Something she wrote in the letter. I have no idea what it means. Sarah was quiet for a moment, then reached out and squeezed my hand. Maybe that's your real inheritance, Lily. A mystery only you can solve. As I drove home through the familiar streets of my hometown, Eleanor's letter sat on the passenger seat like an unwelcome companion. The late August evening was settling into dusk, and the streetlights were beginning to flicker on. I passed the library where Eleanor had volunteered for 20 years, the park where she'd taken me to feed ducks as a child, the church where her funeral had been held just hours earlier. My apartment was a modest place on the second floor of a converted Victorian house, furnished with a mixture of hand-me-downs and yard sale finds. It had always felt cozy before, but tonight it felt hollow, as if Eleanor's rejection had somehow diminished everything around me. I changed out of my funeral dress and into comfortable clothes, then sat at my small kitchen table with the letter spread before me. The paper seemed to mock me with its elegant formality, Eleanor's careful cursive spelling out my unworthiness in permanent ink. You have always been different from the others. Different how? I'd always tried so hard to fit in, to be the granddaughter Eleanor would be proud of. I studied hard in school, graduated with honors from college, found a steady job at the local nonprofit where I helped coordinate community programs for seniors. I'd never been arrested, never caused any family scandals, never given Eleanor any reason to be disappointed in me. Unless a memory surfaced suddenly, sharp and unwelcome. I was 8 years old, standing in Eleanor's garden while she tended to her prized roses. I'd been helping her weed the flower beds when I'd accidentally pulled up one of her favorite plants, mistaking it for a dandelion. "Oh, Lily," she'd said, her voice carrying a note of disappointment that had cut me to the core. "You must learn to look more carefully. Not everything that appears to be a weed actually is one." At the time, I thought she was just talking about gardening. But now, 20 years later, I wondered if there had been a deeper meaning to her words. Had Eleanor seen something in me that the rest of the family missed? Something that made me unworthy of her precious jewelry? The questions multiplied in my mind like weeds in an untended garden. I made myself a cup of tea, the same chamomile blend Eleanor favored, and tried to think logically about the situation. Eleanor was a methodical woman, careful with her words and deliberate in her actions. She wouldn't have written such a harsh letter without reason. But what reason could there be? My phone buzzed with a text message from my mother. "How are you holding up, sweetheart? I know today was difficult." I stared at the message for a long time before responding. My mother, Eleanor's daughter-in-law, had always had a complicated relationship with my grandmother. They'd been polite to each other, even warm at times, but there had always been an undercurrent of tension that I'd never fully understood. "I'm okay," I typed back, though it was far from the truth. "Just processing everything. Call if you need anything. Love you." I set the phone aside and returned to the letter. Look for what matters most in the place where secrets are kept. Eleanor's house was full of hiding places, drawers and cabinets and closets that I had helped her organize over the years. But what kind of secrets would she have kept? And why would she want me to find them now, after explicitly stating that I didn't deserve her jewelry? The inconsistency nagged at me. If Eleanor truly believed I was unworthy, why leave me a treasure map? Why give me any inheritance at all?
Outside my window, the night sounds of my neighborhood settled into their familiar rhythm. The distant hum of traffic, the rustle of leaves in the old maple tree, the occasional bark of a dog.
Normal sounds for a normal evening, except nothing about this evening felt normal. I found myself thinking about the other granddaughters and their reactions to their inherited jewelry. Sarah had seemed genuinely happy, but also guilty about my exclusion. Jessica had been more focused on her bracelet than on my feelings, which was typical for her. She'd always been the most self-centered of my cousins. Madison had tried to be diplomatic, as usual, and Emma, the youngest, had barely looked at me, too overwhelmed by receiving her first real piece of valuable jewelry. None of them had seemed surprised by my exclusion. That realization hit me like a cold wind, making me sit back in my chair with a sharp intake of breath. They'd known. Somehow, they'd all known that I wouldn't be receiving anything, which meant that Eleanor's decision hadn't been a last-minute impulse. It had been planned, discussed, perhaps even anticipated by the family. The thought made my stomach twist with a mixture of hurt and anger. I pulled out my laptop and opened a new document, thinking I might try to make sense of my thoughts by writing them down. But instead of typing, I found myself staring at the blank page, my mind racing with memories of Eleanor and our relationship over the years. She'd always been kind to me, patient with my questions, and interested in my opinions. When I'd struggled with math in high school, she'd hired a tutor for me without being asked. When I'd been heartbroken over my first serious breakup in college, she'd invited me to spend a weekend at her house, feeding me homemade soup and listening to me cry without judgment. These weren't the actions of a grandmother who found her granddaughter unworthy. These were the actions of someone who cared deeply, someone who wanted to see me succeed and be happy. So why the letter? Why the cruel final judgment that seems so at odds with everything I thought I knew about our relationship? The grandfather clock in my living room, another yard sale find that reminded me of Eleanor's house, chimed 11 times, marking the end of one of the strangest and most painful days of my life. Tomorrow, I decided, I would return to Eleanor's house. I would search for whatever secrets she'd hidden away, not because I hoped to find some forgotten jewelry or valuable object, but because I needed to understand. I needed to know what I'd done to lose my grandmother's love and whether there was any way to earn it back, even in death. The next morning arrived, gray and overcast, matching my mood perfectly. I'd slept poorly, waking every few hours with fragments of dreams about Eleanor and her mysterious letter. By 6 a.m., I gave up on sleep entirely and made myself breakfast, though the toast tasted like cardboard and the coffee did nothing to clear the fog in my head. My routine, which had felt comforting just days before, now seemed hollow and meaningless. I showered, dressed for work, and gathered my things, but every action felt mechanical, as if I were moving through someone else's life. The drive to the Riverside Community Center, where I had worked for 3 years, took me past Eleanor Street, and I found myself slowing down as I approached her house. The driveway was empty now, no longer filled with the cars of family members coming to pay their respects. The windows stared blankly at the street, and the morning newspaper still lay on the front porch uncollected. It struck me that Eleanor would have been horrified by this neglect. She'd always been meticulous about maintaining appearances, believing that a well-kept home reflected a well-ordered mind. I pulled into the driveway on impulse, using the key Eleanor had given me years ago to let myself inside. The house felt different in the morning light, emptier somehow, as if the very walls were mourning her absence. The dining room table had been cleared of the jewelry boxes, leaving only the faint impression in the dust where they'd sat. "Hello?" I called out, just in case one of my relatives had returned early, but my voice echoed back unanswered, confirming that I was alone with Eleanor's secrets, whatever they might be. I started in her bedroom, the place that had always felt most private, most personal. Eleanor's 4-poster bed was neatly made, the quilt she'd sewn herself pulled tight across the mattress. Her dresser top was arranged with the same precision she'd maintained in life: silver-backed hairbrush and mirror set, a small crystal dish for rings, a photograph of my grandfather in his Navy uniform. The drawers yielded nothing unusual: carefully folded undergarments, silk scarves arranged by color, a small jewelry box that I now knew was empty. I moved to her walk-in closet, where her clothes hung in neat rows, organized by season and occasion. The scent of her perfume, a light floral fragrance she'd worn for as long as I could remember, still clung to the fabric. On the top shelf of the closet, pushed back behind winter coats, I found a collection of hat boxes. I'd seen them before over the years, but had never thought to ask about their contents. Now, standing on a step stool to reach them, I wondered if this might be the place where secrets are kept that Eleanor had referenced in her letter. The first box contained exactly what I'd expected: hats from various decades, each wrapped in tissue paper and preserved with the same care Eleanor had shown everything in her life. But the second box felt different when I lifted it down. Heavier, with something shifting inside that didn't sound like fabric. I carried it to Eleanor's bed and lifted the lid carefully. Inside, beneath a layer of tissue paper, was a collection of photographs, letters, and documents that I'd never seen before. My hands trembled slightly as I began to examine them, unsure of what I might find. The photographs were old, some dating back to what looked like the 1960s based on the clothing and hairstyles. Many featured Eleanor as a young woman, but there were also pictures of people I didn't recognize. Men and women who seemed to be friends or colleagues, gathered at parties or social events. One photo in particular caught my attention. Eleanor, probably in her early 30s, standing arm in arm with a woman who looked strikingly familiar. I studied the photograph more closely, and my breath caught in my throat. The woman next to Eleanor looked exactly like me. Same dark hair, same green eyes, same slightly pointed chin that had always made me feel self-conscious. But that was impossible. This photo was taken at least 20 years before I was born. Beneath the photographs were letters, dozens of them, tied together with faded ribbon. The return addresses were from all over the country: California, New York, Florida, Texas. I untied the ribbon with shaking hands and opened the first letter dated 43 years ago. Dearest Ellie, I hope this letter finds you well. Life in San Francisco continues to be everything we dreamed it would be when we were young. The gallery is thriving, and I've been invited to show my work in a group exhibition next month. I think about you often, especially when I'm working in my studio. Do you remember how we used to paint together in your parents' garage, dreaming of the day we'd both be real artists? I know you chose a different path, but I hope you're finding happiness in your new life. Please give my love to Harold and the children. All my love always, M. M? I flipped through the letters quickly, looking for a full name, a clue to the identity of this mysterious correspondent. But each letter was signed the same way, simply M. The letters spanned decades, chronicling a life lived far from our small town. M had become a successful artist, traveled the world, loved and lost and loved again. But through it all, she'd maintained a correspondence with Eleanor that suggested a deep and abiding friendship. Or perhaps something more than friendship. The realization crept over me slowly as I read through the letters. The language was careful, coded in the way that people of Eleanor's generation might have used to hide relationships that weren't socially acceptable. But the emotion beneath the careful words was unmistakable. These weren't just friendly letters. They were love letters. My grandmother, the woman who had been married to my grandfather for 47 years until his death, who had raised 4 children and been a pillar of our conservative community, had been in love with a woman named M. And from the photographs, it was clear that M looked exactly like me.
I sat back on Eleanor's bed, surrounded by the evidence of a secret life I'd never suspected. The implications were staggering, not just for what they revealed about Eleanor, but for what they might explain about her treatment of me. You have always been different from the others. Different because I looked like the woman Eleanor had loved and lost? Different because every time she looked at me, she was reminded of a life she'd chosen not to live, a love she'd sacrificed for convention and family expectations.
My phone buzzed with the call from my supervisor at the community center, and I realized I was supposed to be at work. I'd completely lost track of time while reading the letters. "Hi, Janet," I answered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Lily, honey, I was expecting you an hour ago. Are you okay? I know yesterday was difficult with the funeral and all." "I'm so sorry. I'm at my grandmother's house and I lost track of time. I can be there in 20 minutes. Take your time, dear. Take the whole day if you need it. Mrs. Patterson can cover your programs. Grief is a process, and you shouldn't rush it." I thanked Janet and hung up, grateful for her understanding. The community center was used to accommodating personal emergencies. It was one of the things I loved about working with seniors in community programs. But I also felt guilty for lying, even by omission. This wasn't just about grief anymore. This was about uncovering a truth that could change everything I thought I knew about my family. I carefully returned the letters to their box and continued searching through Eleanor's room. In the bottom drawer of her nightstand, pushed far back behind extra batteries and reading glasses, I found a small leather journal. The entries were sporadic, dating back decades, but they painted a picture of a woman struggling with desires and feelings she couldn't openly acknowledge. "Saw Em today at the grocery store. She's visiting her sister for the holidays. We talked for a few minutes about nothing important, the weather, the church fundraiser, Harold's promotion at work. But her eyes, God help me, I still see the same look in her eyes that I fell in love with all those years ago. Sometimes I wonder what my life would have been like if I'd been brave enough to choose love over expectation. But then I look at my children, and I know I made the right choice, didn't I?" Another entry, years later, Em sent another letter today. She's opening her own gallery in Santa Fe. She sounds happy, fulfilled in a way I've never been. Harold found the letter before I could hide it and asked who Em was. I told him she was an old friend from high school. He seemed satisfied with that explanation, but I could see the question in his eyes. I need to be more careful. The children can never know about this part of my life. It would destroy everything we've built. And then, much more recently, Lily helped me in the garden today. She has such gentle hands with the plants, such patience with the work. She reminds me so much of Em at that age, not just in looks, but in spirit. There's an independence about her, a willingness to question things that the other grandchildren don't have. Sometimes I catch her watching me with such understanding in her eyes, as if she knows there are parts of my life I've never shared. It breaks my heart and fills it at the same time. She's the closest I'll ever come to having a piece of Em in my life, and that makes me love her more and fear for her more than I can say. I closed the journal with trembling hands, my eyes burning with unshed tears. The picture was becoming clearer now, but it raised as many questions as it answered. Eleanor had seen something of her lost love in me, had treasured that connection, but had also feared it.
But fear of what? And why had that fear translated into excluding me from her will? I spent the rest of the morning searching through Eleanor's house, looking for more clues to explain her final message to me. In the attic, I found boxes of Christmas decorations, old photo albums, and my grandfather's military memorabilia. In the basement, there were gardening supplies, canning jars, and furniture covered with dust sheets. But it was in Eleanor's study, a small room off the main hallway that she'd used for correspondence and bill paying, that I found the most significant discovery. Hidden behind a false back in one of the desk drawers was a manila envelope marked "For Lily," to be opened only after my death. My heart pounded as I opened it, half afraid of what I might find inside. The envelope contained a birth certificate, but not mine. This one was for someone named Margaret Rose Thompson, born in 1942 in our same small town. The mother's name was listed as Eleanor Marie Hartley, Eleanor's maiden name. But that was impossible. Eleanor had been born in 1940, making her only 2 years older than this Margaret Rose. Unless I studied the birth certificate more closely,
noting details I'd missed on first glance. The father's name was listed as unknown. The mother's address was the same street where Eleanor's family had lived when she was young, and in the corner of the document, in faded ink, someone had written, "Twin sister, given up for adoption." Eleanor had had a twin sister, a sister she'd never mentioned, never acknowledged, never spoken of in all the years I'd known her, a sister who had been given up for adoption and presumably raised by another family. Margaret Rose Thompson. M. The woman Eleanor had loved wasn't just someone who looked like me, she was Eleanor's twin sister, separated at birth and reunited years later, only to fall in love with each other without knowing their true relationship. And I was the granddaughter who reminded Eleanor of this impossible, tragic love story, the one who carried the features of both twins in my face, who embodied the secret that had shaped Eleanor's entire life. No wonder she'd found me both precious and dangerous. No wonder she'd struggled with how to treat me, how to love me, without revealing the truth that could destroy not just her reputation, but her memory of the only real love she'd ever known. I sat in Eleanor's study chair, surrounded by the detritus of her secret life, and finally understood why she'd written that letter. It wasn't because she didn't love me. It was because she loved me too much, in too complicated a way, and she'd never known how to handle the weight of that love. But understanding the why didn't make the pain any less sharp. If anything, it made it worse, because now I knew that Eleanor's rejection of me had been about her own guilt and fear, not about any failing on my part. I was the living reminder of her greatest shame and her deepest love, and she'd never found a way to reconcile those two truths. The days following my discovery in Eleanor's study passed in a haze of questions and uncertainty. I'd taken a leave of absence from work, telling Janet that I needed time to settle Eleanor's affairs, which was true enough even if it wasn't the complete truth. The real truth was that I could barely function, knowing what I now knew about my grandmother's secret life and my place in it. I'd made copies of everything, the letters, the photographs, the birth certificate, the journal entries, and hidden the originals back where I'd found them. Some instinct told me that revealing this information prematurely could cause irreparable damage to people I cared about. But keeping the secret was eating me alive. 3 days after the funeral, my Aunt Patricia called to ask if I'd be available to help clean out Eleanor's house. We're planning to put it on the market next month, she explained, her voice brisk and businesslike. You know how much Mom accumulated over the years?
I agreed to help, partially because I genuinely wanted to assist the family, but mostly because it would give me more opportunities to search for answers. When I arrived at Eleanor's house the next morning, I found my Uncle Robert already there, sorting through boxes in the living room. "Morning, Lily," he said, looking up from a box of books. "How are you holding up?" "I'm managing," I replied, though the shadows under my eyes probably told a different story. "Where should I start?" "Patricia thought you might want to go through Mom's personal papers. You always had a head for organization, and you probably understand her filing system better than the rest of us." The irony wasn't lost on me. Of course they'd assigned me to go through Eleanor's papers, the very place where her deepest secrets were hidden. It was like being asked to curate my own emotional destruction. I spent the morning in Eleanor's study, carefully removing documents from drawers and filing cabinets while making sure not to disturb the hiding places where I had found the most damaging evidence. Tax returns, insurance policies, correspondence with lawyers and doctors, all the mundane paperwork of a life lived in the open, while the real story remained hidden behind false backs and in forgotten hat boxes. Around noon, my cousin Jessica arrived with her teenage daughter Megan in tow. Jessica was carrying a large purse, and I noticed she seemed nervous, her eyes darting around the room as if looking for something specific. "How's it going in here?" she asked, leaning against the doorframe of the study. "Slowly," I replied. "There's a lot to go through." "Find anything interesting?" The question seemed casual, but there was something in Jessica's tone that put me on alert. Just the usual stuff: bills, legal documents, correspondence with her accountant. I watched Jessica's face carefully as I spoke, looking for any sign that she might know about Eleanor's secrets. "That's good," Jessica said, but she seemed distracted. "Listen, Lily, I've been thinking about what happened at the reading of the will, about the jewelry distribution." Here it was. I'd been waiting for one of my family members to bring up the elephant in the room. "What about it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Well, it just seems so unlike Grandma Eleanor. She always treated all of us equally. I can't figure out why she would single you out like that." The word single hit me like a slap. Jessica was right. Eleanor had singled me out, but not in the way my cousin meant. "I've been wondering the same thing," I admitted. Jessica moved closer, lowering her voice even though we were alone in the room. "Megan, go help Uncle Robert in the living room," she instructed her daughter, who rolled her eyes but complied.
Think about it. You were closer to her than any of us in her final years. You had access to her house, her papers, her personal belongings. If someone had wanted to influence her decisions, the implication hit me like a physical blow. Jessica was suggesting that I had manipulated Eleanor, that I had somehow caused my own exclusion from the will. The accusation was so far from the truth that it would have been laughable if it wasn't so hurtful. "Jessica, you can't be serious." "I'm not saying you did anything wrong." She backtracked quickly, but her eyes remained hard. "I'm just saying that the family is confused about Grandma's decision, and we want to make sure everything was above board." "Above board?" My voice was rising, and I had to consciously lower it. "Are you accusing me of elder abuse? Of coercing an 83-year-old woman?" "I'm not accusing you of anything," Jessica said, but her tone suggested otherwise. "I'm just saying that if there was any undue influence, well, these things can be contested." The threat was clear. My family suspected me of manipulating Eleanor, and they were considering legal action to investigate her final wishes. The irony was devastating. They thought I had caused my own exclusion, when in reality, I was the victim of Eleanor's complicated feelings about her secret past. "You want to contest the will?" I asked, incredulous, "even though I'm the one who didn't receive anything?" "That's what makes it so suspicious," replied Jessica. "Who would exclude themselves from a will unless they were trying to cover up something bigger?" I stared at my cousin. This woman I'd grown up with, played with as a child, celebrated birthdays and holidays with for 29 years. And she was looking at me like I was a stranger, someone capable of taking advantage of our elderly grandmother for personal gain. "Get out," I said quietly. "Lily, get out of this room, get out of this house. If you want to contest the will, talk to your lawyers, but don't you dare stand in my grandmother's study and accuse me of hurting her." Jessica's face flushed red, but she held her ground. "This isn't over, Lily. If you did something to influence Grandma against the rest of the family, we'll find out." She left the room, calling for Megan to follow her. I heard their car door slam a few minutes later, followed by the sound of tires on gravel as they drove away. I sank into Eleanor's desk chair, my hands shaking with rage and hurt. The accusation was so unfair, so completely opposite to the truth that it felt like screaming. But even worse than the injustice was the realization that Jessica's suspicions were probably shared by other family members. Uncle Robert appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, his expression apologetic. "I heard raised voices," he said gently. "Everything okay?" "Jessica thinks I manipulated Eleanor."
She thinks I somehow convinced her to exclude me from the will as part of some elaborate scheme.
Robert's face darkened. That's ridiculous, Lily. Anyone who knew you and Mom together could see how much she cared about you. Then why didn't she leave me anything? Why that letter? Robert was quiet for a long moment, studying my face. Finally, he spoke. Can I tell you something in confidence? I nodded, desperate for any insight that might help me understand the situation. About 6 months ago, Mom called me late at night. She was upset about something. She kept saying she'd made mistakes, that there were things about her life that none of us understood. She asked me what I thought about secrets, whether some things were better left buried, or if truth was always worth pursuing. My heart began to race. What did you tell her?
I told her that truth usually finds a way to surface eventually, and that family secrets have a way of poisoning relationships if they're kept too long. Robert's expression was troubled. She got very quiet after that, and then she said something strange. She said, "What if the truth would hurt the person you love most?" I didn't know how to answer that. The pieces were starting to form a clearer picture, but it was a picture that terrified me. Eleanor had been struggling with whether to reveal her secret, and somehow that struggle had led to her decision to exclude me from the will. But I still didn't understand the connection. "Uncle Robert," I said carefully, "did Eleanor ever mention anyone named Margaret to you, or just M?" His face went pale. "How do you know about Margaret?" The question hit me like a thunderbolt. He knew. Somehow Uncle Robert knew about Eleanor's secret. "I found some letters," I admitted, "and other things." "Robert, who was Margaret?" He closed the door to the study and sat down heavily in the chair across from Eleanor's desk. "I was hoping this would stay buried with Mom," he said quietly. "But I guess if you found letters—" "Please, I need to understand what happened, why Eleanor wrote that letter to me, why she excluded me from the will. My own family thinks I manipulated her." Robert was quiet for a long time, clearly wrestling with how much to reveal. Finally, he began to speak. Margaret was Mom's twin sister. They were born in 1940, but Margaret was given up for adoption almost immediately. Our grandparents, they were very young, unmarried, and they couldn't afford to raise 2 babies during the Depression. They kept Mom and gave Margaret away. But they found each other later? When Mom was in college, Margaret had been looking for her birth family and tracked Mom down. They met in secret. Our grandparents had made Mom promise never to tell anyone about Margaret's existence. They were ashamed of the whole situation. Robert's voice grew quieter, more strained. Mom and Margaret became close, very close. They looked identical, thought alike, shared everything. But somewhere along the way, their relationship, it became something more than sisterly. I felt sick. The truth was even worse than I'd suspected. They didn't know they were related? Not at first. Margaret had been told her birth parents were dead. Mom had been told the same story. When they finally figured out the truth, it was too late. They were already— He couldn't finish the sentence. "In love," I whispered. Mom was devastated. She broke things off with Margaret immediately, never told her the real reason why. Margaret kept writing for years, begging to know what she'd done wrong, but Mom never explained. Eventually, Margaret stopped trying. And then Eleanor married Grandpa Harold? Within 6 months. I think she was trying to prove to herself that she was normal, that she could have a conventional life. But she never got over Margaret, never stopped loving her. I thought about the journal entries I'd read, about Eleanor's decades of guilt and longing. And I remind her of Margaret?
Robert looked at me with sad eyes.
You're the spitting image of what Margaret looked like as a young woman. Same hair, same eyes, same way of moving through the world. When you were born, Mom took one look at you and nearly fainted. So she excluded me from the will because I reminded her of Margaret? I think she excluded you because she was afraid of how much she loved you, Robert said gently. Every time she looked at you, she saw the person she'd given up everything for. And she was terrified that somehow that love would become inappropriate again. The room felt like it was spinning. Eleanor hadn't rejected me because I was unworthy. She'd rejected me because she'd been afraid of loving me too much, of crossing boundaries that she'd already crossed once before in her life. But I'm her granddaughter, I said, my voice breaking. There was never any danger of, I know that and you know that, but Mom, she carried so much guilt about Margaret. She convinced herself that her feelings for you were somehow tainted by that earlier relationship. She thought that by keeping you at arm's length, she was protecting both of you from something that could never happen anyway. I put my head in my hands, overwhelmed by the tragedy of it all. Eleanor had punished both of us for a crime that existed only in her own guilty conscience. Does anyone else know about this? Patricia has her suspicions, but Mom never confirmed anything. I only know because I found Mom burning papers in the backyard about 10 years ago. I confronted her about it, and she broke down and told me everything. The sound of car doors slamming interrupted our conversation. Through the window, I could see Patricia's car in the driveway, and she wasn't alone. Jessica was with her, along with another car I didn't recognize. That's Mom's lawyer, Robert said grimly, looking out the window. Jessica must have called her. Within minutes, the house was filled with people, and the atmosphere had shifted from family grief to something much more adversarial. Patricia marched into the study with Jessica close behind, followed by a middle-aged woman in a business suit carrying a briefcase. "Lily," Patricia said, her voice coldly formal, "this is Margaret Dobson, Mom's attorney. We need to discuss some concerns about Mom's will." The irony of the lawyer's first name wasn't lost on me, but I didn't have time to dwell on it. Ms. Dobson was opening her briefcase and pulling out official-looking documents. "Miss Thompson," the lawyer addressed me, "I understand there are questions about your grandmother's mental state in the months before her death and about your level of access to her personal affairs." "What kind of questions?" I asked, though I already knew where this was heading. "Questions about whether your grandmother was of sound mind when she made certain decisions regarding her will, and whether those decisions may have been influenced by outside pressure." I looked around the room at my family members, Patricia, Jessica, and even Uncle Robert, who avoided my eyes. They were all there to witness my interrogation, to see if I would crack under the pressure of their accusations. I never pressured Eleanor about anything. I helped her with errands and companionship because I wanted to, not because I expected anything in return. "But you did have unusual access to her home and personal belongings," Patricia interjected. "Because she trusted me." The words came out louder than I intended. "She trusted me to help her maintain her independence as she got older. I never abused that trust." Ms. Dobson made notes on a legal pad. "Can you explain why your grandmother would exclude only you from her jewelry distribution while including all of your cousins?"
This was the question I'd been dreading. How could I explain Eleanor's decision without revealing the family secrets that would destroy everyone in this room? How could I make them understand that I was the victim of Eleanor's guilt, not the perpetrator of some elaborate scheme? "I don't know," I said finally. "I've been asking myself the same question." "That's not good enough," Jessica said sharply. "Grandma Eleanor was always fair with all of us. The only thing that changed in recent years was how much time you spent with her. Are you suggesting that spending time with my grandmother was somehow manipulative?" "I'm suggesting that you had opportunities the rest of us didn't have," Jessica shot back. "Opportunities to influence her thinking, to make her believe that we didn't deserve her jewelry. The accusation was so far from the truth that I almost laughed. If anything, Eleanor's letter suggested that she thought I was the one who didn't deserve anything. "Have you read the letter Eleanor left me?" I asked, pulling it from my purse. "Would someone who is being manipulated write this?" I handed the letter to Miss Dobson, who read it quickly, her expression growing more puzzled with each line. "This is unusual," the lawyer admitted. "It almost sounds like she was angry with you, not protective of you." "Exactly," I said, relief flooding through me. "Does this sound like a letter written by someone who was being manipulated by the recipient?" Patricia snatched the letter from the lawyer's hands and read it herself, her frown deepening. "This doesn't make sense. Mom was never angry with you, Lily. She adored you." "Then why did she write this?" I demanded. "Why did she exclude me from the jewelry distribution? Why did she say I didn't deserve it?" The room fell silent. For the first time since this accusation had started, my family members seemed to be considering that maybe I wasn't the villain in this story. Maybe I was just as confused and hurt as they were. Robert cleared his throat. "Maybe we should focus on settling Mom's affairs instead of fighting among ourselves. She's only been gone a week. This kind of conflict would break her heart." "It's too late for that," Jessica said bitterly. "The damage is done. Either Lily manipulated Grandma or Grandma lost her mind at the end. Either way, that will should be contested." "On what grounds?" asked Ms. Dobson. "I drew up Mrs. Henderson's will myself, and I can attest that she was completely lucid and specific about her wishes. She knew exactly what she was doing." "Then she was being manipulated," Jessica insisted. "By whom?" the lawyer asked. "Miss Thompson, who, according to this letter, was specifically excluded from the estate? That doesn't make sense legally or logically." I could see the doubt creeping into my family members' faces. The accusation that had seemed so certain to them an hour ago was crumbling under scrutiny. But instead of feeling vindicated, I felt hollow. Even if they believed I wasn't guilty of manipulation, I still had no answers for Eleanor's cruel final message. "I think we should all take some time to cool off," Robert suggested. "Mom's funeral was less than a week ago. We're all grieving, and we're not thinking clearly."
But Patricia wasn't ready to let it go. "There has to be an explanation. Mom didn't just decide overnight to exclude one granddaughter from her will. Something happened, and I want to know what it was." I looked around the room at these people who had been my family for my entire life and realized that Eleanor's secret was poisoning us all, just as Robert had warned it would 6 months ago. The truth was creating exactly the kind of division and suspicion that Eleanor had feared, and she wasn't even alive to see the damage. "Maybe some secrets are meant to stay buried," I said quietly, echoing Eleanor's own words from her conversation with Robert. "Not this one," Patricia replied firmly. "I'm going to find out what really happened, Lily, and if you know something you're not telling us, I'd advise you to speak up now." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was just beginning to burn. I realized that my discovery in Eleanor's study was only the beginning of a much larger crisis. My family was fracturing along lines of suspicion and accusation, and the truth that might heal us was also the truth that could destroy us, and I was the only one who knew it. The confrontation in Eleanor's study marked the beginning of the most difficult period of my life. In the days that followed, the family divided into fractions. Patricia and Jessica were convinced that some form of manipulation had occurred, while Robert tried to play peacemaker. My other cousins and relatives chose sides or tried to stay neutral, but the tension was palpable at every family interaction. I threw myself into research, desperate to find some way to prove my innocence without destroying Eleanor's reputation or revealing family secrets that would devastate everyone I loved. I spent hours at the public library looking up legal precedents for contested wills, reading about elder abuse cases, trying to understand how accusations like Jessica's typically played out. What I found wasn't encouraging. Even unfounded accusations of undue influence could tie up an estate in court for years. The legal costs alone could consume much of Eleanor's modest estate, leaving nothing for anyone to inherit. Worse, the investigation would inevitably uncover Eleanor's personal papers and correspondence, making it impossible to keep her secrets hidden. A week after the confrontation, I received a call from Ms. Dobson, Eleanor's lawyer. "Ms. Thompson, I'd like to schedule a private meeting with you. There are some aspects of your grandmother's estate that I think you should be aware of." We met at her office the next day, a small suite in one of the downtown buildings that had seen better decades. Ms. Dobson was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and an efficient manner, someone who had clearly been practicing law in our small town long enough to understand the weight of family secrets. "I've been your grandmother's attorney for 15 years, she began, settling behind her desk with my file. "In that time, I've learned that Eleanor Henderson was one of the most thoughtful, deliberate people I've ever represented. She didn't make impulsive decisions, especially about important matters." "Then why exclude me from the jewelry distribution? Everyone keeps saying it was out of character for her." "That's what I wanted to discuss with you." Ms. Dobson opened the file and pulled out several documents. "Your grandmother came to see me 6 times in the last year of her life. Each visit, she wanted to modify her will in some way. The final version we settled on was actually her 7th draft." My heart began to race. "What did the other drafts say?" "The first draft left everything to be divided equally among all family members, including you. The second draft created a special provision leaving you additional items. Books, gardening tools, some of her personal effects that she thought you'd appreciate." I felt tears prick my eyes. That sounded like the Eleanor I knew and loved. What changed?
In the third draft, she removed the special provisions for you, but kept you in the equal distribution. In the fourth, she reduced your share. By the fifth, she'd excluded you entirely from the jewelry, but left you other items. The sixth draft was the harshest. It excluded you from everything except that letter. And the seventh? The final version. She added back a provision for you, but it was cryptic. Ms. Dobson pulled out another document. She insisted on including a clause that said, "Additional inheritance for Lily Thompson shall be determined by her ability to understand the truth about family bonds and the courage to do what is right, even when it is difficult." I stared at the legal document, trying to make sense of Eleanor's words. What does that mean? I asked her the same question. She said you would understand when the time was right, and that I should give you this when questions about her will arose. Ms. Dobson handed me a sealed envelope with my name on it in Eleanor's handwriting. My hand shook as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with an address I didn't recognize, along with a brief note. "If you want to understand why I made the choices I did, visit this address. Ask for Margaret Rose. Tell her Eleanor sent you and that it's time for the truth. But be prepared, my dear granddaughter. Some truths change everything." Margaret Rose. Eleanor's twin sister was still alive. "Miss Dobson, do you have any idea what this means?" The lawyer studied my face carefully. "I suspect it means your grandmother set up a test for you. She wanted to see if you would fight for the truth even when it was difficult. And based on the recent accusations from your family members, I'd say you're facing exactly the kind of difficulty she anticipated." The address on the paper was in Millbrook, a town about 2 hours away. I'd never heard Eleanor mention having any connections there, but then again, I was learning that there were many things about my grandmother's life that I'd never suspected. "There's something else," Ms. Dobson continued. "Your grandmother established a trust account that I've been managing for the past 5 years. She added to it regularly, and it now contains a substantial sum of money, more than the value of all the jewelry she left to your cousins combined." I felt dizzy. A trust account? For me? "The funds will be released to you once you fulfill the conditions of the clause I mentioned, when you demonstrate understanding of family bonds and the courage to do what is right, even when it is difficult. But Lily, I have to warn you, your Aunt Patricia has filed papers to contest the will. If this goes to court, everything will come out. Every document, every provision, every secret your grandmother tried to protect.
The weight of the decision settled on my shoulders like a heavy blanket. I could fight the accusations against me, reveal Eleanor's secrets, and claim whatever inheritance she'd left for me, or I could walk away, let my family believe what they wanted to believe, and preserve Eleanor's reputation at the cost of my own. But Eleanor's final letter suggested a third option: find Margaret Rose, learn the complete truth, and then decide what to do with that knowledge. I left Miss Dobson's office with more questions than answers, but also with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since Eleanor's death. That evening, I called in sick to work and made plans to drive to Millbrook the next day. The drive gave me time to think about everything that had happened since the funeral. My family's accusations, the discovery of Eleanor's secret correspondence, the revelation that she'd had a second identity.
Margaret set down her teacup with shaking hands. All those years, I thought she'd stopped loving me. I thought I'd done something wrong, said something that offended her. I never imagined. She loved you too much to tell you the truth. She thought it would destroy you both. It destroyed us anyway, Margaret said bitterly. At least if I'd known, I could have understood why. We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us processing the enormity of the revelation. Finally, Margaret spoke again. You said she left you a note. What did it say? I showed her Eleanor's final letter to me, the one that had started this entire journey. Margaret read it carefully, her expression growing more puzzled with each line. She excluded you from her will? But why? What did you do to make her think you didn't deserve her jewelry? Nothing, I said. That's what I've been trying to figure out. My family thinks I manipulated her somehow, but the truth is the opposite. She excluded me because I reminded her of you. Margaret studied my face again, taking in every detail. You do look remarkably like I did at your age. It must have been painful for her, seeing me and your features every day. She loved me and resented me at the same time. She was afraid that her feelings for me were somehow inappropriate because I reminded her of her great love. That's ridiculous, Margaret said firmly. You're her granddaughter. There was never any possibility of... I know that, and deep down, she knew it too. But she carried so much guilt about your relationship that she convinced herself her love for me was dangerous somehow. Margaret stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the small town that had been her home for decades. She punished both of us for something that wasn't our fault, she said finally. We didn't know we were sisters when we fell in love. We were just two young women who found something beautiful in each other. She never got over the guilt. Neither did I, for different reasons. I spent 40 years thinking I'd been rejected for some flaw in my character, some failing that made me unlovable. Do you know what that does to a person? I thought about the past 2 weeks, about my family's accusations, and my own feelings of unworthiness. I'm beginning to understand. Margaret turned back to me, her expression resolute. Eleanor made a mistake by keeping this secret. It poisoned her life and mine, and now it's poisoning yours. That ends today. What do you mean? I mean, it's time for the complete truth. All of it. Your family deserves to know why Eleanor made the choices she did, and you deserve to be free from accusations that aren't true. But the scandal, the shame it would cause, would be nothing compared to the damage this secret has already done, Margaret said firmly. Eleanor thought she was protecting everyone by keeping quiet, but she was wrong. Secrets like this don't protect people. They destroy them.
I thought about Eleanor's words to Uncle Robert months before her death. What if the truth would hurt the person you love most? She'd been afraid that revealing her secret would hurt me, but her silence had hurt me far more than the truth ever could have. There's something else, I said, and told Margaret about the trust fund Eleanor had established, about the legal challenges from my family, and about the clause requiring me to demonstrate understanding and courage. Margaret smiled for the first time since I'd arrived. She was testing you. She wanted to see if you would fight for the truth even when it was difficult. I'm scared, I admitted. If I reveal everything, it will change how my family sees Eleanor forever. She'll go from being the perfect grandmother to being someone with a scandalous past. Or, Margaret said gently, she'll go from being a perfect saint to being a human being who loved deeply and made mistakes and tried to do what she thought was right, even when it caused pain. Which version sounds more real to you? I knew she was right. Eleanor's perfection had always felt a little hollow, a little too controlled. Understanding her struggles and her secrets made her more human, not less worthy of love. Will you come with me, I asked, when I tell my family the truth? Margaret was quiet for a long moment, considering. I haven't seen any of Eleanor's family since we were young. They probably don't even remember me. Uncle Robert knows about you. He's the one who told me you existed. Robert was just a little boy when I knew the family. He's grown up to be a good man. I think he'd support us in telling the truth. Margaret looked around her gallery, at the life she'd built for herself in this small town, at the artwork that reflected decades of living with unanswered questions. I'm 75 years old, she said finally. If I don't face this now, I never will. We spent the rest of the afternoon talking about Eleanor, about their time together as young women, and about the decades of separation that had followed. Margaret showed me more photographs, sketches she'd made of Eleanor from memory, and letters she'd written but never sent. I never married, she told me as we looked through the memorabilia of their relationship. I had relationships over the years, but no one ever compared to Eleanor. I spent my whole life loving someone who I thought had rejected me for no reason. She never married for love either. She married my grandfather because she thought it was what she was supposed to do, but according to her journal, she never stopped loving you. What a waste, Margaret said sadly. All those years we could have been friends at least, all those years of silence and separation. But maybe it's not too late to honor what you had together. Maybe telling the truth now can give meaning to all that pain. Margaret squeezed my hand. Eleanor chose well when she sent you to find me. You have her courage, but you also have something she never had, the willingness to risk everything for truth. As the sun set over Millbrook, we made plans for Margaret to come home with me the next day. We would face my family together, reveal Eleanor's secrets, and finally give both Eleanor and Margaret the peace that had eluded them for 40 years. But first, I had one more stop to make. Wait, I need to continue this section as it should be longer. Let me add more content to section 4 to reach the proper word count target. That evening, Margaret and I drove back toward my hometown, but we stopped first at the cemetery where Eleanor had been buried just over a week ago. Margaret had insisted on visiting the grave before confronting the family, saying she needed to have a conversation with Eleanor before dealing with the living.
The cemetery was quiet in the twilight, with only the sound of wind through the old oak trees and the distant hum of traffic from the main road. Eleanor's grave was easy to find. It was still covered with flowers from the funeral, though some of them were beginning to wilt in the summer heat. Margaret stood silently at the foot of the grave for several minutes, tears streaming down her face. I gave her space, walking a few steps away to examine other headstones while she had her private moment with Eleanor. "I should have fought harder," she said finally, her voice carrying across the quiet cemetery. "I should have demanded answers instead of just accepting your silence." "She thought she was protecting you," I said gently. "She was protecting herself," Margaret replied, but there was no anger in her voice anymore, just sadness. She was protecting the image of the perfect life she'd built, the reputation she'd cultivated. She thought love was something to be ashamed of. Margaret knelt down next to the grave and placed her hand on the freshly turned earth. "I forgive you, Ellie," she whispered. "I forgive you for the silence, for the secrets, for the 40 years of questions, but I won't let your granddaughter suffer for your choices anymore." As we drove the remaining hour to my hometown, Margaret told me more stories about her life with Eleanor in college. They had been roommates first, drawn together by their shared love of art and literature. The physical resemblance had been remarkable even then, with people often mistaking them for sisters. "We used to joke about it," Margaret said. "We'd say we must have been separated at birth,
that we were probably twins who had found each other again. If only we'd known how right we were. Their friendship had deepened into something more intimate over the course of their sophomore year. In the 1960s, such relationships were dangerous, requiring absolute secrecy. They had been careful, discreet, creating a private world for themselves away from the judgment of society. We planned to move to California together after graduation. Eleanor was going to study art, and I was going to teach. We had it all figured out. How we'd live together as roommates, how we'd build careers that would let us travel and create, and be together without anyone suspecting the true nature of our relationship. What happened? Eleanor went home for Christmas break senior year and met your grandfather at a family friends party. When she came back to school in January, everything had changed. She was distant, formal with me. She said she'd been thinking about her future and had decided she wanted a traditional life: marriage, children, stability. She never told you the real reason? Never. She just said she'd realized she couldn't continue living a lie. I thought she meant our relationship was the lie. Margaret's voice grew thick with emotion. I begged her to tell me what I'd done wrong, but she just kept saying she was sorry, that it was better this way, that I'd understand someday. And she married my grandfather that summer? 3 months after graduation. I wasn't invited to the wedding, of course. I heard about it from mutual friends. Margaret wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I left for California the next week and never looked back. I thought if I could just get far enough away, I could forget her. But you never did.
How could I? She was the love of my life, and I never understood why I lost her. I wrote letters for years, hoping she'd eventually explain what had happened between us. When she stopped responding entirely, I finally gave up. As we reached the outskirts of my hometown, I felt a growing sense of anxiety about the confrontation that lay ahead. My family was already suspicious and divided. How would they react to learning that their beloved matriarch had been keeping such a monumental secret? "Are you sure you're ready for this?" I asked Margaret as we pulled into my apartment complex. "I've been ready for 40 years," she replied. "The question is whether your family is ready to hear the truth." We spent the evening planning our approach. Margaret suggested that we start with Uncle Robert, since he already knew part of the story. From there, we could decide how to approach the rest of the family. "There's something else you should know," Margaret said as we sat at my kitchen table, going over the documents I'd found in Eleanor's house. "I've been financially successful over the years. The gallery, my artwork, some investments. I have more money than I could ever spend. If your family contests Eleanor's will and ties up the estate in legal battles, I want to make sure you're not harmed financially." "I can't accept money from you," I protested. "Why not? Eleanor left you a trust fund, didn't she? Consider this an advance on your inheritance, or a gift from the woman who should have been your great-aunt if circumstances had been different." The generosity was overwhelming, but it also highlighted how much damage Eleanor's secret had caused. Here was a woman who had never married, never had children of her own, offering to support the granddaughter of the woman who had broken her heart. The cycles of pain and love in our family seemed to echo across generations. The next morning, I called Uncle Robert and asked if Margaret and I could meet with him privately. I could hear the surprise in his voice when I mentioned Margaret's name. "She's alive? After all these years?" "Very much alive, and she has a lot to tell us about Eleanor's past." We arranged to meet at his house that afternoon. His wife Diane was visiting her sister for the weekend, which would give us privacy to have what was likely to be a very emotional conversation. Robert's home was a modest ranch house on the edge of town, surrounded by the kind of carefully maintained garden that spoke of a man who found peace in working with his hands. He met us at the door, and I watched his face change as he took in Margaret's appearance. "My God, he said softly. "You look just like Mom did when she was young." "We were identical twins. I'm told you know at least part of the story?" Robert invited us into his living room, where family photographs covered every available surface. Margaret moved among them slowly, studying images of the family she'd never been allowed to know. "This is Eleanor's wedding picture," Robert said, pointing to a formal portrait on the mantel. "She looks beautiful, doesn't she?" Margaret studied the photograph for a long time. "She looks terrified," she said finally. "Look at her eyes, Robert. That's not the face of a happy bride." I looked more closely at the photograph I'd seen dozens of times over the years. Margaret was right. There was something haunted in Eleanor's expression, a fear or sadness that I'd never noticed before.
She married Harold 3 months after graduation, Margaret continued. 3 months after she broke off our relationship without explanation. I used to think it was a rebound, but now I understand it was an escape. Robert sat down heavily in his favorite armchair. "Tell me everything," he said. "I know pieces of the story, but I want to understand the whole truth." Margaret and I took turns explaining what we'd discovered: the birth certificate, the letters, Eleanor's journal entries, and the revelation of their true relationship. Robert listened without interruption, his expression growing more pained with each detail. "She carried this guilt for 60 years?" he asked when we finished. "Longer," Margaret replied. "She was carrying it when she married your father, when she had her children, when she raised Lily and her cousins. Every day of her life, she was running from a love she thought was shameful." "But it wasn't shameful," Robert said firmly. "You didn't know you were sisters. How could you be blamed for falling in love?" "That's what I've been trying to tell Lily," Margaret said. "Eleanor punished herself and everyone around her for something that was nobody's fault. Now her granddaughter is paying the price for that self-punishment." Robert looked at me with understanding in his eyes. "That's why she excluded you from the will. You reminded her of Margaret, of the choice she made to give up love for convention." "And now my family thinks I manipulated her," I said. "Patricia and Jessica are convinced I somehow influenced Eleanor against them." "We have to tell them the truth," Robert said without hesitation. "All of it. They deserve to understand why Mom made the choices she did." "Are you sure?" I asked. "This will change how everyone sees Eleanor. She'll go from being the perfect grandmother to someone with a complicated, scandalous past." "Good," Robert said firmly. "Perfect people don't exist, Lily. The Eleanor we thought we knew was a fiction she created to hide her pain. The real Eleanor was a woman who loved deeply, made mistakes, and spent her life trying to atone for choices that didn't need atonement." Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a manila envelope. She brought something that might help explain Eleanor's state of mind in her final years. Inside were more letters, but these were different from the ones I'd found in Eleanor's house. These were letters that Margaret had written to Eleanor but never sent, drafts of correspondence that she'd composed over the decades, but had lacked the courage to mail. I wrote to her constantly in my mind: birthdays, holidays, when I had exhibitions or achievements I wanted to share. I wrote her letters when I was angry, when I was sad, when I missed her so much I could barely function. Robert read through several of the letters, his expression growing more emotional with each page. "You loved her your whole life," he said softly. "I loved the memory of her, and the hope that someday she might explain why she left me." Margaret's voice was steady, but I could see tears in her eyes. I built my entire life around the absence of one person. So did she. In her own way, so did she. We spent the next hour planning how to approach the rest of the family. Robert suggested calling a family meeting for the following evening, telling everyone that new information about Eleanor's will had come to light. "Should we tell them what it's about beforehand?" "No," Margaret said. "If we give them time to prepare arguments or defenses, they'll just become more entrenched in their positions.
Better to present the evidence all at once and let them process it together.
This is going to be painful for everyone, Robert warned. Mom was the cornerstone of this family. Learning that she kept such a major secret will shake everyone's sense of reality. But it will also free Lily from false accusations, Margaret pointed out, and it will finally give Eleanor's story the honest ending it deserves. As we prepared to leave Robert's house, he pulled me aside for a private conversation. Lily, I want you to know that no matter how the family reacts to this revelation, I believe you did the right thing by finding Margaret and uncovering the truth. Even if it destroys everyone's memory of Eleanor, it won't destroy their memory, Robert said gently. It will complicate it, make it more human and more real. And in the long run, that's healthier than worshiping a perfect saint who never existed. That evening, Margaret stayed in a local hotel while I prepared for what might be the most difficult conversation of my life. I laid out all the evidence we'd gathered, the photographs, letters, birth certificate, and journal entries, arranging them in chronological order to tell the story as clearly as possible. My phone rang around 9 o'clock. It was my mother, calling from her home 3 states away. Lily, honey, Patricia called me. She said there's going to be a family meeting tomorrow about Eleanor's will. She's very upset, saying something about new evidence of manipulation. I closed my eyes, dreading what I was about to put my mother through. Mom, there's going to be some shocking information revealed tomorrow. Information about Eleanor's past that will be difficult to hear. What kind of information? I can't explain it over the phone. Can you come down for the meeting? Lily, you're scaring me. Are you in some kind of legal trouble? No, Mom, but Eleanor was in emotional trouble for most of her life, and I'm the only one who can explain why. My mother agreed to drive down the next morning, and I spent the rest of the evening calling other family members to ensure they would all be present. By the time I finished making calls, word had spread through the family network that something significant was happening. Several relatives who lived out of town were making arrangements to attend. Margaret called me just before I went to bed. "Are you having second thoughts?" she asked. "Every few minutes," I admitted. But I keep thinking about Eleanor's letter to me, about her belief that I didn't deserve her jewelry. If I don't clear my name, I'll carry that rejection for the rest of my life. And I'll carry 40 years of unanswered questions for the rest of mine. We both deserve better than that. The next morning dawned clear and warm, the kind of perfect summer day that Eleanor had always loved for her garden work. I picked Margaret up from her hotel, and we drove to Robert's house together, both of us nervous about the confrontation ahead. "Whatever happens," Margaret said as we pulled into Robert's driveway, "I want you to know that meeting you has been one of the best things that's happened to me in years. Eleanor may not have been able to love you the way you deserved, but I can see why you meant so much to her." "Thank you," I said, surprised by how much their words meant to me. "Having you here makes me feel less alone in all of this." The family had gathered in Robert's living room, and the tension was immediately apparent. Patricia sat stiffly in one corner, flanked by Jessica and her daughter Megan. My mother had arrived and was sitting with my cousin Madison, both of them looking confused and worried. Several other relatives had come as well, including Eleanor's sister-in-law, my great-aunt Helen, and 2 of my second cousins. When Margaret and I walked in together, the room fell completely silent. Everyone stared at Margaret, clearly unsettled by her resemblance to Eleanor. "Who is this?" Patricia asked sharply. "This is Margaret Rose Thompson," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "She's Eleanor's twin sister." The statement hit the room like a physical blow. I heard gasps, saw faces go pale, watched as family members looked back and forth between Margaret and me, trying to process what they were seeing and hearing. "That's impossible," Patricia said. "Mother didn't have a twin sister. She would have told us." "Eleanor had many secrets," Margaret said quietly. "Some of them were kept to protect you. Others were kept to protect herself." "I don't believe this," Jessica interjected. This is obviously some kind of scam. Lily has found an actress or something to impersonate a relative and validate her claims to Eleanor's estate. I have birth certificates, adoption records, photographs, correspondence spanning 6 decades. This isn't a scam, Jessica. This is your family's hidden history. Robert stepped forward to support us. I can confirm that Margaret is telling the truth. Mom told me about her twin sister 10 years ago when I caught her burning papers in the backyard. Patricia's face was white with shock. Why would Mother keep something like this secret? Why would she never mention having a twin sister? Because their relationship was complicated, I said, beginning to lay out the documents we'd brought. Because Eleanor was carrying guilt and shame that shaped her entire life. Over the next hour, Margaret and I told the complete story. We showed the family the birth certificate proving Margaret's identity, the photographs of the 2 women together in college, the letters chronicling their relationship, and Eleanor's journal entries revealing her decades of guilt and longing. The room was completely silent as the evidence mounted. Family members passed photographs and letters around, studying them with expressions of shock, confusion, and growing understanding. They were lovers, my great-aunt Helen said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor was in love with her own twin sister. They didn't know they were sisters when they fell in love, Margaret said firmly. They were told their twin was dead. They found each other as adults and developed a relationship before learning the truth. And when Eleanor found out, my mother asked, she ended the relationship immediately and married Harold within months. She thought she was saving both of them from scandal and sin. But she never stopped loving Margaret, Robert added. That's why she was always so controlled, so careful about maintaining appearances. She was terrified that someone would discover her secret. Patricia had been studying one of Eleanor's journal entries, and when she looked up, there were tears in her eyes. All those years, she seemed so perfect, so composed, but she was actually miserable. Not miserable, Margaret corrected gently, but carrying a burden that was too heavy for one person to bear alone. And Lily? Jessica asked, finally beginning to understand. Where does Lily fit into this story?
Lily looks exactly like Margaret did as a young woman, Robert explained. Every time Eleanor looked at her, she was reminded of the love she'd given up and the life she'd chosen not to live. So she excluded me from the will because I reminded her of Margaret? I asked, still trying to fully understand Eleanor's motivations. She excluded you because she was afraid of how much she loved you, Margaret said softly. She thought her feelings for you might be inappropriate because you looked like me, because you reminded her of a relationship she'd been taught to be ashamed of. My mother spoke up, her voice thick with emotion. Eleanor punished her own granddaughter for reminding her of love? She punished everyone, herself most of all. She spent 60 years trying to atone for a love that never needed atonement. The family meeting continued for another 2 hours, with relatives asking questions, expressing shock and anger and sadness, and gradually beginning to understand the complexity of Eleanor's life and choices. Some were angry that she'd kept such a significant secret. Others were heartbroken that she'd carried such a burden alone. But gradually, a consensus emerged. Eleanor had been human, flawed, and worthy of compassion rather than judgment. I owe you an apology, Lily, Jessica said finally. I was so wrong about you manipulating Grandma Eleanor. You were as much a victim of her secret as anyone. We all were, Patricia added. Mother's fear poisoned all of us to some degree, but at least now we understand why. As the family meeting wound down, Miss Dobson arrived with the legal documents needed to formally resolve Eleanor's estate. With the truth revealed, the challenges to the will were dropped, and arrangements were made to release the trust fund that Eleanor had established for me. There's one more thing, Margaret said as the formal business was being concluded. I want to establish a scholarship fund in Eleanor's name for young people studying art or literature. I think she would have wanted her story to help others pursue the dreams she gave up. That's a beautiful idea, my mother said, speaking for the first time since the revelations had begun to sink in.
Eleanor always supported education and the arts. And I want to donate half of my inheritance to the scholarship fund, I added. Eleanor may not have been able to love me the way I needed, but I can honor her memory by helping others avoid the kind of regret that shaped her life. As the family began to disperse, each person processing the day's revelations in their own way, Margaret and I found ourselves alone with Robert in his garden. "What will you do now?" Robert asked Margaret. "I'm thinking of moving back here," she replied, surprising both of us. "I've spent 40 years in exile from the place where I was born. Maybe it's time to come home. And maybe it's time for this family to stop keeping secrets. Eleanor's story should be told, not hidden away out of shame." Robert nodded. Mom would have wanted that, I think. In the end, she wanted the truth to come out. That's why she sent you to find Margaret. When Eleanor Henderson died, she left a devastating letter that would change her family forever. While all her other granddaughters received precious jewelry, one granddaughter was excluded with the cruel words, "You don't deserve it." What seemed like a final rejection became the key to unlocking a 60-year-old family secret that would transform their understanding of love, courage, and authenticity. The excluded granddaughter's quest for answers led her down a path of mystery and discovery. Through cryptic clues, old letters, and forgotten photographs, she began to piece together the truth about Eleanor's past. The investigation revealed that Eleanor had been hiding a profound secret since her college years, a secret love affair with her roommate Margaret that had been forced underground by the social pressures of the 1960s.
Eleanor and Margaret had been deeply in love, planning a life together in California where they could live openly. But family pressure and societal expectations tore them apart. Eleanor was forced to choose between her authentic self and family acceptance, ultimately marrying a man and living a conventional life, while Margaret disappeared into a life of artistic exile, painting portraits of the woman she'd lost for 60 years. The cruel letter wasn't an act of rejection. It was Eleanor's final test. She was challenging her granddaughter to have the courage she'd never possessed, to seek truth even when it was painful, to choose authenticity over comfort, and to understand that love comes in many forms. The revelation transformed the entire family. Margaret, now in her late 70s, was welcomed back into the family she'd never been allowed to know. Together, the granddaughter and Margaret established a scholarship fund in Eleanor's name for young artists and writers, ensuring that future generations would have the support Eleanor and Margaret had been denied. The garden Eleanor had tended with such care became a memorial space where truth replaced secrets. The family learned to see Eleanor not as the perfect matriarch they'd idolized, but as a complex human being who had struggled with impossible choices, and ultimately found the courage to trust them with her truth. Margaret settled back in their hometown, displaying artwork that had captured 60 years of longing. The community embraced her return, healing old wounds and celebrating a love that had been hidden for too long. Annual memorial garden parties became celebrations of authenticity and courage, attended by scholarship recipients who learned Eleanor's most important lesson: don't let fear prevent you from living boldly. The story became a book, then a documentary, reaching people worldwide who recognized their own struggles with family acceptance and authentic living. Eleanor's final gift wasn't jewelry. It was the lesson that secrets are heavier than truth, and that love is never something to be ashamed of. Found the story compelling? Stories of family secrets, hidden love, and the courage to seek truth resonate across generations. Subscribe to hear more incredible true stories of people who chose authenticity over convention, and discover how the past continues to shape our understanding of love, family, and what it truly means to live boldly. Don't miss the next extraordinary tale of human resilience and the power of truth to heal.